So today I'm going to speak to you about Isma'ili thought, and particularly the thought of an 11th century Isma'ili Muslim thinker from Persia whose name was Nasir-i Khusraw. So just a quick hands, who here has heard of the Ismailis? Anyone? Okay, good. Oh, well, that's easy then. So a quick reminder for everyone, the Ismailis are part of the Shia branch of Islam, and as you may recall, Shia Muslims believe in an institution of spiritual leadership known as the Imamate, and Shia Muslims affirm that the Prophet Muhammad had appointed his own cousin Ali ibn Abi Talib as the first Imam, the first spiritual leader of the community, and that this Imamate continues in a line of designated lineal descendants from the first Imam, Ali. And eventually Shia Muslims would become divided over the question of which is the rightful line of Imams. So among the major Shia groups today, you have the Twelver Shi'i who believe in a line of 12 Imams, and then you have the Isma'ili Shi'i who trace the line of Imams through a certain person named Ismail, the son of Ja'far al-Sadiq. And today, the Ismailis actually follow a present Imam. Their 49th Imam today is known as the Aga Khan. So Nasir Khusraw belongs to the group of Isma'ili Shi'i, and as an Isma'ili, Nasir Khusraw believed that the Imam was the source of divinely inspired guidance through both religious instruction as well as esoteric interpretation. And in the 9th and 10th century, Isma'ili doctrine was actually explicated by an organization known as a Dawah. This is literally an organization of Isma'ili teachers, and Isma'ili doctrine would come from them, and Nasir Khusraw was among those teachers. So to give you some context, these are some of the Muslim thinkers and theologians we've heard about so far. I made a little timeline. This is a list of some of the prominent Isma'ili thinkers of the same period. So you can see that Isma'ili thought is being elucidated at the same time as the other forms of Muslim philosophy and theology. And because of that, Isma'ili thought, a lot of it is in response to views that are already circulating around. One thing you'll find in Isma'ili thought is a distinction between the outer or exoteric aspect of religion and as opposed to the inner or esoteric aspect of religion. But unlike the philosophers who mainly used esoteric interpretation to look at some of the more ambiguous verses of scripture, the Ismailis used esoteric interpretation for almost everything. So just as you have a literal meaning of the Qur'an and the physical acts of worship, the Ismailis would talk about the esoteric meaning of those same Quranic verses, as well as an esoteric dimension of all Islamic acts of worship, such as prayer. Metaphysical doctrines such as Tawhid, creation, revelation, the Ismailis put that in the category of the esoteric. They considered falsafa, like the logical techniques of falsafa, as actually part of the outward aspect and not the inner aspect. So from here we move on to Nasir Khusraw. Who was Nasir Khusraw then? So he was born in Khorasan, and like many of the people we've heard about so far, he was living the comfortable life for some time. At age 42, he tells us in his poetry that he had some sort of epiphany, although there isn't much detail on what exactly happened. And in his poetry, which I quote here, we can sort of gather that Nasir Khusraw was on some sort of quest for truth, and he was asking a lot of questions about theology and philosophy to many different people, and he basically tells us that he was not able to find the answers that he was seeking. One day Nasir tells us he was reading the Qur'an, and he came across a Quranic verse known as the verse of Bayah, where the Qur'an says, "Those who give their allegiance to the Prophet have given their allegiance to God. The hand of God is upon their hands." And Nasir Khusraw read this, and he thought to himself, where is the hand today that I should be able to pledge myself to? Right? It's not my fault, he reasoned, that I was not born at the time of the Prophet. So with that belief in mind, and the details once again we don't exactly know, but Nasir ends up going to Cairo. And in Cairo he finds the Imam of the Ismailis, who's also the Caliph of the Fatimid Empire at that time, and Nasir pledges his allegiance, his bayah, to the Imam al-Mustansir. And he spends some years in Cairo. He's initiated into Ismaili doctrine. Then he returns to his native Khorasan. but due to difficulties there, he's banished from Khorasan, and Nasir is exiled to Badakhshan. And it's in Badakhshan that he writes both poetry and his prose works. And his final work is called the Jami al-hikmatayn, which literally means the reconciliation of the two wisdoms. And Nasir intends this work to be a way in which he is going to reconcile the wisdom of revelation, as the Ismailis interpret it, and the knowledge of falsafa. And he tells us in the intro to this book that, treasury of wisdom lies in the prophet. That's what the first line is saying. But then Nasir concedes, he says, there's also a whiff of wisdom in the writing of the ancients. So he does not see falsafa and revelation as equal, but he does believe there's a common truth between these two, and his mission in this text is to bring out that common truth. Now, this text has over 30 chapters. I'm only going to discuss 2 issues today. That's all we'll have time for. But I have a copy of the text if anyone wants to borrow it or anything like that. So to begin, I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 issues. The first thing I'll quickly talk about is Nasir's understanding of Tawhid. I've picked this because this is something we're already familiar with. The first 2 weeks of class, we studied different views on God and his attributes, and I've summarized them up here, the Ash'ari, Mu'tazili, and the Falsafa views. So Isma'ili concepts of Tawhid are always positioned in this context. A lot of time they're responding to what's already there. So unlike these views, for Nasir Khusraw, God is not subject to any attributes whatsoever. God cannot be described by the 99 names, for example. So Nasir actually maintains that 99 names of God implies, multiple essences, and God is absolutely one. So you cannot actually have a God with 99 names or attributes. So Nasir rejects the literal names of God, but Nasir Khusraw also rejects the opposite of those names. And this gets a little interesting, where you have a technique of double negation. So Nasir and the Ismailis would say, God is not knowing, and then they would add, and God is not knowing. The purpose here is to negate the positive attribute, because these are attributes of created things, and then negate the negative attribute because it is also an attribute of created things. And this is a form of apophatic theology that takes us far beyond the Ash'ari, Mu'tazili, or philosophical notions. Some of Nasir's views on Tawhid are also directed against the philosopher's own views. So it was very common to say, as a philosopher, that God is the first cause. But Nasir will not accept that. He thinks it is wrong to say that God is a cause, and the reason why he says that is because in his definition, a cause necessarily produces its effect. But to say that God is a cause, that would tie him to his effect. So he rejects that. He also rejects the fact that God is a necessary being. Because for Nasir Khusraw and these Ismaili thinkers, God is not qualified by being or non-being. So you have this completely attributeless God in Ismaili thought. And in that context then, we will talk about how does Nasir Khusraw understand creation. So if there are questions, I will take them at the end just so I can get through everything. But then you're welcome to ask the questions that you want. So how does he understand creation? For Nasir, he believes that God originates, and he uses the term origination and not creation. God is the originator of all being by his command. And this command is this mysterious act of bringing being into being spontaneously. It's an act that cannot be explained. Command does not occur automatically, such as the philosophers would say. It does not occur by nature. It's an act of will. And I'm just going to diagram this for you so everyone can keep track. The command is not temporal. In fact, the command of God for Nasir and Khusraw is equivalent to eternity, and God himself is not eternal, but God is the maker of the eternal, what you could translate as the eternalizer, so you could also translate it as pre-eternal. And the first thing to come into being from the command of God in this cosmology is the universal intellect. Now the universal intellect is very similar to the first cause concept that you find in Al-Farabi, for example. So everything we read about the first cause being one, being perfect, it contains everything, it intellects itself. Nasir Khusraw will take that idea, but he'll apply it to the universal intellect and not God per se, because he feels these are all limitations on God. And interestingly, while Nasir Khusraw negates the names from God and his nature, he then goes and applies the names, such as the One, the Eternal, the Living, not to God, but to the universal intellect. The universal intellect, as the most perfect being, is also the knowing, the powerful, the living. So it's a very interesting thing you have here, where God, insofar as human beings can conceive him, is not actually God at all. It's actually the first originated being, and that makes for some very interesting theology. And that is how Nasir Khusraw interprets these anthropomorphic verses in Scripture. So when the Qur'an, or if I went and said, God is all-knowing, Nasir Khusraw says, okay, we are going to understand this esoterically to mean that God created the intellect, which is actually all-knowing. So that is his approach to the notion of attributes and God and creation. The creative process continues, though, after the universal intellect. This intellect intellects its own self, it contemplates itself, and it recognizes God. It simply recognizes that it has been originated by something beyond its grasp. That's what the intellect knows. And this self-contemplation of the intellect causes a second being to emanate, to flow out of it, and that's called the universal soul. The universal soul, however, is not like the universal intellect, because the universal soul is potentially perfect, but it is not actually perfect. And we've talked about potential and actual in class already. So the universal soul has a certain need to make itself perfect, and that need causes the universal soul to move. So motion comes from the universal soul, and that motion of the universal soul is what creates the cosmos. And this is very interesting, because this cosmology is saying that the creation of our world happens for a very precise reason. And the reason for the creation of our world in this cosmology is for this universal soul to attain perfection. And it will attain perfection through the creation of human souls in the cosmos. And as human souls become perfect, and we've already talked about that journey, the universal soul will come closer to its own perfection. And that's basically what this quote from Nasir Khusraw is telling us there. And that quest for perfection is even manifested in history. So the whole history of prophets and revelations, Nasir understands this as a manifestation of this universal soul coming closer and closer to perfection, because it is able to create prophets who are perfect human souls. So the last thing then I'll quickly go through is, in this system, what is the relationship between intellect and divine command or divine authority? So Nasir believes that human souls are potentially perfect. And because they're potentially perfect, they possess intellect, but in a very undeveloped or innate level, innate intellect. But he also believes that this human soul and intellect must be nourished. They must be actualized by knowledge. And he thinks then that there must be someone on earth who's already actual in terms of intellect. There must be an actual intellect who can nourish and actualize the innate intellect. And of course, as a Shia Isma'ili Muslim, Nasir Khusraw believes that that the actual intellect is the Prophet in his time and the Imam in his time. So thus, in this view, the whole purpose of divine revelation and religion is not something parallel to reason, like the philosophers have it, but religion is actually essential to the development of the human intellect. Religion and revelation and teaching feeds the human intellect and makes it what it is. And the actual intellect of the Prophet or Imam is itself inspired by the universal intellect. And this is just a quote that's saying the same thing from one of Nasir Khusraw's work. It's interesting because Nasir Khusraw doesn't only write about this, but he actually, in his poetry, relates his own experience of being actualized. So in one of his poems, Nasir Khusraw writes that, "When the light of the Imam of the time shone upon my soul, even though I was as dark as night, I became the glorious sun. The supreme name of God is the Imam of the time by which I ascended, Venus-like, from the earth to heaven." So in his own mystical experience, Nasir-i Khusraw, you could say, had internalized this sort of doctrine. So then this brings me to just some concluding remarks. I have not been able to do justice to the depth or the breadth of Isma'ili thought or Nasir-i Khusraw's own thought. But there is a great amount of influence of the Isma'ili legacy in later periods of Islamic history. Sometimes the influence manifests in an interesting way. For example, al-Ghazali, who devoted pages and pages of anti-Isma'ili polemic, right? But in a way, that just goes to show the influence. Al-Sharastani, who was regarded as one of the foremost Kalam theologians of Sunni Islam, the contemporary evidence has come to light that suggests that al-Sharastani may have been a crypto-Ismaili, an Ismaili in secret. And there's even further influences as you go down the line. So some things that we can reflect on, although we're not experts in this, so maybe it would be too difficult, but is Ismaili thought falsafa, or is it kalam, or is it something else? Is it a synthesis which we could perhaps call theosophy? Another question we could ask is, in this thought system, what is the relationship between intellect, revelation, and spirituality? And the final point that I'll make today is, and this is a question we ask, what is the relevance of the theology that we learn? So in terms of this, the Nasir-i Khusraw intellectual legacy is very much alive today. There's ranges of communities in Central Asia that still read his works in the primary sources, that still practice the rituals that he started, that revere him, and that have a lot of love for Nasir-i Khusraw. And this legacy manifests in different ways, and I'll give you one example. The image you see here on the right, that is an Isma'ili center that was recently built in Dushanbe. That's in Tajikistan. And what's interesting is that over here on the other image you see here, you see the president of Tajikistan, and you see the Aga Khan, the Imam of the Ismailis, actually inaugurating this center. And when the Aga Khan inaugurated the center, interestingly, the person he mentioned was Nasir-i Khusraw. And I direct you to the end, and I'll end off by just reading the end of this. The passage of a millennium has not diminished Nasir-i Khusraw's relevance, nor dulled the luster of his poetry. It continues to uplift and inspire, reminding us that we are the authors of our own destiny. As he said, we can be like a poplar tree which chooses to remain barren, or we can let our path be lit by the candle of wisdom, for only with intellect can we seek out all the hows and whys. Without it, we are but trees without fruit. Thank you very much for your time.